This week, we'll be talking about sexual orientation. As an object of scientific research, in my personal opinion, I think that sexual orientation is something of a moving object right now. There are things that we know about sexual orientation and how it's expressed, how it develops, but there's also plenty we don't know. And so my intent here this week is to present some information to give you what we do know. But the vast majority, I hope, of this week and our next discussion will be spent reading some of the most recent literature on sexual orientation, trying to understand what the future of research in this area looks like, where it needs to progress. And so I hope to have really quite a developed discussion this week, as you'll see. So first I want to go over some features of sexual orientation. What do we know? What patterns have we observed about how sexual orientation manifests and why it may exist in the first place? Why are there organisms, individuals, who are potentially not heterosexual, attracted to the opposite sex, which is what you would expect would lead to the most amount of reproduction? Well, sexual orientation, as defined, is one's identity. So this is an identity construct. This is something that you, a label that you may potentially put upon yourself to describe some aspect of your sexuality. So it's an identity in relation to the genders that a person finds sexually attractive. So if you are heterosexual, you are predominantly attracted to people of the opposite sex. If you're a man, attracted to women, women attracted to men, vice versa, etc. If you are homosexual, attracted to someone of the same sex. If you are bisexual, some amount of attraction to one or another gender. But really, the labels have, in recent years especially, and I think rightfully so, have grown to encompass other aspects as well. So gender as a construct is something that can be relatively fluid. It can be more androgynous, not clearly male or female. And so your identity in relation to a gender can be as complex as gender can be. And so you have types of sexual orientation such as pansexuality. Some people lump together demisexuality, which is attraction less to gendered traits and more to aspects of personality and how closely you feel to someone, as well as asexuality. That is, not much sexual attraction to either gender or anyone in particular. And then, of course, you can have people who are more genderqueer, which is a gendered characteristic, but it's going to affect sexuality in as much as gender just may not matter that much, that there are other traits besides these male or female typical traits that determine your sexual attraction. Some people report a certain amount of attraction to intelligence. That is, if you look like you can handle yourself, adapt to new situations, that is sexier than any gendered trait could potentially be. So again, sexual orientation is a moving target, but this is the working definition that we are going to be using. I would say the most popular measure of sexual orientation is the one developed by Alfred Kinsey. He developed a 7-point scale describing sexuality as sexual orientation as a continuum between being completely and exclusively heterosexual and completely and exclusively homosexual. And then you have variation in between. For example, if you're not completely heterosexual, the next step would be something like you are predominantly attracted to opposite sex individuals and only incidentally attracted to someone of the same sex. This, for example, might be something that you see within prisons, where someone may predominantly be, if available, attracted to and have sex with someone of the opposite sex. But without much opportunity, sexuality can be a little bit more flexible, and therefore you have relationships with people who are of the same sex. So at the middle of this is bisexuality, equal attraction to men and women. If you look at the frequency of individuals based on age group of whether they are bisexual, completely homosexual, completely heterosexual, you can see that these numbers have changed presumably over time. This is data collected from YouGov in 2018, in which they show the frequency of people who identify as completely hetero, completely homo, or some amount of bisexual in between across different age groups. And you can see that people who are relatively older tend to report exclusive heterosexuality and then to some degree bisexuality and homosexuality on the right side of the chart. But as you get into younger generations, and this might be a matter of how old you are, or it could be a matter of when did you grow up, at what point did you were you raised, and what are your attitudes towards sexual orientation, younger people seem more willing, more eager to identify themselves as bisexual to some degree. You do see this. The number of people who identify as bisexual has increased within recent years. Yet, funnily enough, the number of people who identify as completely homosexual has remained relatively stable. So, although people are identifying more with bisexuality, exclusive homosexuality still seems to be something of a constant. This is a good scale, and I respect this scale immensely for, I think, the nuance that it is given to the description of sexual orientation, but I don't think that it does a perfect job. And one of the criticisms that I personally have of this scale is that it makes some presumption about a person's gender. That is, if I say that you're heterosexual, that means that you must be male, for example, attracted to women. That is, not only am I describing your attraction to women, I'm also describing your gender. And that may not always fit everyone, especially given that gender can be something that is more fluid or less defined for some individuals. One alternative that I find has merit is something called the androphilia-gynephilia scale. Androphilia, so the root here, philia, means love of or attraction to. Andro refers to male typical traits, and gyna refers to female typical traits. So rather than presume a person's own gender, these describe, well, simply what are the traits that you are attracted to? Are you attracted to the traits that you would typically see within a man? Or are you attracted to the traits that you would typically see in a woman? And you can see the scale down here. This is actually a screenshot of the scale that I use in some of my studies. Are you generally physically attracted or physically repulsed by men, or male typical traits is one of the more updated versions of the scale that I use. And so you can indicate extremely physically attracted, extremely physically repulsed, or something in between, not attracted but also not repulsed. And you do this separately for men and women. I think that the strength of this is that it helps to define bisexuality in a much finer grained way. That is, you could be high on both of these, such that you're extremely physically attracted to men and women, or you could be low on both of these. You're extremely repulsed by both, in which case you may be something more like asexual. So I find that there's merit to this scale, but there are other scales of sexual orientation. I encourage you to go find them, look for them. Another good example is the Klein grid. It's very long, it's very complex. I often do not include it in my own studies simply because it is too complex, and people who take surveys often lose patience if something is too long and complex, but it has many good merits. Taking into account, I think, a dimension that is often ignored, which is how does your sexual orientation change across time? Is your sexual orientation now the same that it was a year ago versus what you expect it to be a year from now? This is important because there is something called sexual fluidity, and that is the degree to which sexual orientation changes across time. What we see with sexual fluidity is that men typically report a more fixed sexual identity or sexual orientation than women do. If you look at this graph on the bottom here, what we have is graphed the Kinsey scale, the frequency with which people identify as heterosexual all the way on the left versus exclusively homosexual all the way on the right, within men and women. Men are noted in blue. Women are noted by the more pinkish magenta line. So you can see that men tend to cluster towards the two ends. You're either exclusively heterosexual or you identify as exclusively homosexual. and there's just not a lot of bisexuality within the middle. Again, this is changing to some degree. This chart is taken from a somewhat older example, somewhat older article, and so the number of men who are identifying as bisexual is going up, but it's still less than the number of women who tend to report bisexuality. And you can see that there is a range in between for women. Why might this be the case? Well, one possibility is that there is a fair amount of stigma against bisexuality, especially for men. Women, one of the advantages that women have in terms of their sexuality is often if a woman is bisexual or even lesbian, there is some more acceptance of that within society than it is for men to be gay or bisexual. And so it could be that one hypothesis that has been put out there is that men especially are pressured into identifying one way or another. If you're not heterosexual, then you must be gay. And so some men might actually, to avoid that stigma, to avoid that pressure, identify as one or the other and really ignore that nuance that may exist in between. One other possibility is that sexual fluidity might be a sexually selected trait. That is, there might be something about being sexually fluid that provides an advantage to women, or at least is less costly to women than it is for men. One idea that I've heard on this front is the idea of alloparenting. That is, if women are the ones who often have to make the largest investment in children, and men may have been likely to leave women after those women got pregnant, one recourse that women may have to help with caring for a child is, well, if the man is not going to be there to help you raise a child, maybe you could find another woman who perhaps has her own children to collectively, together, raise each other's children. This is called alloparenting. That is parenting that relies on people who are genetically unrelated to one another to help take care of each other's children. Now, of course, you can do this without sexual attraction, but it does become easier to some degree if the person who you are spending a lot of time with, who is potentially caring for your children, you have sexual attraction to, that you can capitalize on that romantic attraction to keep the bond together. So again, it's possible that sexual fluidity is more beneficial to women than it is to men. The evidence of this, though, is admittedly scant, so I would take that with a grain of salt. I want to talk a little bit about exclusive homosexuality, because same-sex attraction is something of a puzzle within the scientific literature. Here's what we know. We know that homosexuality is heritable. It has a heritability quotient of somewhere between 30 to 60%, meaning that 30 to 60% of the differences between people in their same-sex sexual attraction seems to be due to genes. So there is a heritable component to homosexuality. And we can rely on twin studies to demonstrate this genetic contribution. So twin studies are those studies in which you actually look at two individuals who share 100% of their genes. So you can piece apart how much of a certain trait is due to those shared genes versus due to some other factor like environment or how they were raised or their family, etc. Okay, well, we know it's heritable, but we also know that it reduces fecundity, which is fertility, how many children you end up having. Homosexual men do have significantly fewer offspring than heterosexual men. So this is odd. How would this trait stick around? How would this trait continue to be passed on to the next generation if it reduces fertility? Well, we know that homosexuality is prevalent. It's not only heritable, but it happens with an appreciable frequency, 2 to 6%, which is actually much higher than you would expect if it were random. If that is, say, these genes that are being passed on just happen by random chance to be passed on to the next generation. So homosexuality is prevalent and it's too abundant to be random. And then we know that homosexuality is ancient. We see it in early documents, prehistoric cave paintings. We see it in historical records. The Romans were especially within higher society, within Roman society, there are plenty of depictions of homosexual behavior. But around the world, this is true. So it's ancient, and beyond that, we see it in animals, which we'll get into in a second. So how does a trait that reduces reproduction survive within the gene pool? A lot of people have looked at non-human homosexuality to try and find an answer. And a lot of the research that exists on sexual orientation, funnily enough, does look at non-human animals. Because this is where you're likely to see some of the most basic, most ancient reasons for homosexual activity. So it's observed in hundreds of species. You can see just some examples down at the bottom there. These are male individuals of each species, although on the very right, I believe the image are of bonobos, and often it's what you'll see is you'll observe homosexual behavior between female bonobos. It's actually used as a way to resolve social conflict, so that is, if they get into fights, they may kind of make up, they resolve that conflict with each other by kissing, by touching, by doing what's called genital rubbing. You can imagine what that is. So homosexuality is prevalent. It happens within other species. If you compare them to humans, human homosexuality is almost entirely unique in two ways. And I say almost because there are some examples in which these things do occur. And you'll see that in a second. So in one way, humans are really the only species that practice exclusive homosexuality. In the wild, even if you observe homosexual activity among non-human animals, if given the opportunity to perform that sexual behavior with someone of the opposite sex, they'll take that opportunity. But people who report exclusive homosexuality very often will simply not experience attraction to the opposite sex. Of course, if you do, that's some degree of bisexuality, and so it's really kind of a mystery why exclusive homosexuality would exist within humans. Yet, you do see about 1/4 of the monogamous pairings between black swans. This is an example of an exception, are male to male, and sometimes these are lifelong. So even if they're given the opportunity to have sex with the opposite sex, they'll do it. But in the process, as they are pairing off, as they are choosing a lifelong partner, they will still choose these male-male relationships and then stick with them. So there is this lifelong bonding as much as you'd see it in humans. And then in humans, you also observe something called homophobia. And quite literally, this means fear of same-sex sexual attraction, but it goes beyond fear. It goes beyond into moral judgment. What this looks like is humans will pay close attention to the sexual orientations of others and then do something about it often. They may have very strong moral beliefs that homosexuality is wrong, and therefore they take some kind of corrective action, unfortunately. Very few animals do the same thing. So other animals will not typically monitor others' sexual orientation, and especially they don't tend to punish individuals who express homosexual behavior. So for one reason or another, humans are odd in this way. One example is in velvet-horned white-tailed deer. These are an interesting example where you can have gay deer of this species who resemble females. That is, in this species, male and female deers look a little bit different. The patterning on their fur looks a little bit different. Their body size is a little bit different. And so these gay male deer actually resemble females within that species. And what this often looks like is there's a strategy that's ubiquitous across many different species called very colloquially, you'll find this in a textbook, is they're called sneaky fuckers, in which a male deer who looks like a female will enter a group looking like a female, perhaps be mated with by the males within that group, but because they are not recognized as a male, they don't attract the aggression or the fighting from other males. And so what they can do is get into a group, have sex with the women in that group, get them pregnant without having to fight other men. Well, if they're discovered as having sex with the female, they will be continuously attacked. So the more masculine male deer will attack them if, say, they're trying to enact this strategy of being a quote-unquote sneaky fucker. And so they're often forced to live in separate communities, eerily similar to humans in a lot of ways. Perhaps we can talk about that in discussion. So this gives us a little bit of an idea of maybe why homosexuality exists and the unique aspects of humans, but it really doesn't answer the question of how is this going to survive, even though it reduces reproduction. Another pattern that we know that is consistently observed is that those who have same-sex attractions are on average more gender atypical. That is, if they are born with XY chromosomes, they have male gonads, they may develop a penis. Though if that individual has same-sex attractions, they are more likely to appear atypical for the male gender. That is, they'll look a little bit more feminine. And vice versa for women, will appear a little bit more masculine. This is not just in appearance, this is also in all of the traits that I noted that can differ between the sexes. Personality traits, cognitive traits, etc. Differences in preference. So if we look at rough and tumble play, which is a relatively more masculine trait, you see that young boys will tend to play more roughly and kind of have these, they'll tackle each other relative to women. Physical activity and aggression are lower in boys who have same-sex attraction, and they're higher in girls with same-sex attraction. Gay men will perform worse on those mental rotation and target accuracy tasks, which men tend to be better at overall, but better on object location memory and face recognition, which are typically advantaged within women compared to heterosexual men. Same with lesbians. Lesbians will perform better on mental rotation, but worse on object location memory than heterosexual women. So there seems to be almost a reversal, where if you have some amount of same-sex attraction, you have other traits that are also gender atypical. And both gay men and lesbians will report less gender conformist behavior and in their occupations, the kind of jobs that they take. So there's something that seems to be noticeable or that seems to cue or signal that someone has same-sex attraction that we can observe. And you can kind of see this in the colloquial idea of gaydar. I'm not sure if you've heard of this before, but this is when you can identify or ID sexual orientation just from looking at someone. Some people claim to have a very good sense of this, just knowing when someone's gay or not. Well, if given the opportunity, people can actually, at zero acquaintance, that is, they've never met the person before, at above chance accuracy, assess the sexual orientation of someone. So gaydar does seem to exist. So here's what we know at this point. We know that exclusive same-sex attraction exists, that it's prevalent, that it has a pattern whereby you see gender atypicality with those who have same-sex attractions. Well, what causes it all? What is what's underlying the development of non-heterosexual orientation? We're going to try and tackle that. That'll be the focus of next week's lecture. This week, though, I want to focus on these two articles. These are published in 2020, both of them, so they're fairly recent, in which Lippa goes into fair detail about the various personality and sexuality traits that distinguish people of different sexual orientations, and this is in a large representative United States sample. And then the Pachonkas article, they look at the degree to which individuals who are same-sex attracted can actually experience many of the same types of conflicts due to intra-sexual competition that people within heterosexual relationships can. And so I hope to talk about these in depth. Please do read these articles before our discussion. We'll talk about them.